We're recording.
Perfect. So I just wanted to thank you for taking the time here for us to kind of geek out about corporate entrepreneurship. And I know you've seen a lot of things. And so I wanted to give you kind of the conversation of things that you've seen. Again, we're starting this class to be the future leaders of corporate entrepreneurship and kind of giving them the tools that are outside the norm of many MBAs. So that they can perhaps be the future leaders of multinational corporations that, or even, just small, medium-sized enterprises domestically that have tangible tools of not having the fluffy entrepreneurship, right?
I love it. Yep.
And so just wanted to get your thoughts on things you've seen and working with different entities. If you could influence the future partners that you might have, what might be those educational nuggets that you could provide everybody?
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And I love the word you used there, describing it as tangible. I think a lot of corporate entrepreneurship and a lot of corporate innovation is fluffy, nice to haves, and makes good PR statements and marketing announcements. But at the end of the day, it has a lot less of an impact than it potentially could, which is why you see so many of these big corporations get disrupted by more agile, more flexible entrepreneurs that are in the startup ecosystem compared to the corporate ecosystem.
Right. In strategy, we teach that hope is not a strategy, right? Yeah. We get into the corporate entrepreneurship realm and it's, let's throw money at it and hope something comes out, right?
Yeah, and let's throw money at it and not necessarily a strategic, smart way.
Right.
A lot of times, a lot of money gets thrown at it and nothing actually happens. And a lot of times, some money gets thrown at it, but at the end of the day, it's not nearly enough of it.
Right.
I think that's kind of my first point is I always say, show me the money. A lot of times these internal corporations, they're tasked with saving the world. So what I mean by that is saving the existing company and the existing structure, but then at the same time, building a brand new one. Some of the corporate innovation projects that we work on at Shadow Ventures, we go to them with a proposal and, here's the work we're going to do. Here's how much it's going to cost to actually get it done. And 99% of the time, they don't have the budget to actually do what they need to do, yet their team's mission is to create a new billion-dollar business. So if they don't have the budgets aligned with it, they don't have the resources to actually execute on what they've been tasked to do. And so the wheels just keep turning.
Right. And from your experience, has there been, based on what people have worked on, roughly what kind of budgets might those look like, or what kind of percentage of revenue, or how do you think about those things?
Yeah, so I think it depends on kind of what group you're talking to. If it's an internal R&D team, so I kind of break innovation or entrepreneurship and corporates into a few different buckets. I think you have your traditional R&D, which is kind of the way it was in the past. Those teams have largely started to focus now using like more innovation, more entrepreneurship. That kind of led into corporate incubators where they're trying to start up internal startups. And then you also have different groups like corporate venturing groups that are going and investing in outside startups to try to bring their technology in. And then you, of course, even your M&A group at some level is entrepreneurial because they're looking at going out and actually acquiring new businesses to bring in.
Right.
I see that a lot of times the R&D teams are pretty well funded on the R&D side, but when it comes to the execution side, those budgets fall really fairly short. The M&A teams are always flush with cash because they can go and get it from debt and other sources. So it's not necessarily coming off of the company's books today. CVC teams in some cases have decent operating capital to invest in companies, not so much on the research side. It's a lot of times, I think, the incubators that really get the short end of the stick in these instances. Shadow Ventures is a venture capital firm. We invest in startups. And if you look at how much money is put into the best, well-funded startups, it's millions and millions of dollars. Even at the seed stage, these companies are raising usually at a minimum of $1.5 million. And that's for 2 to 3 founders to have only 12 months runway. If you compare that to what's actually happening in the corporate setting, it's a fraction of that. If you look at some of on the later stage entrepreneurial companies, they're getting hundreds of millions of dollars put into them to all focus on growth and business development. And on the corporate side, in actual external spending that they're allowed, it's hundreds of thousands. So it's really not a fair comparison to look at how much money gets put into external startups and how much capital they have access to and they can go raise from venture capital firms compared to what the internal corporate startups are actually given to work with as a budget.
Yeah, and I think with that structure, right, most corporations, we've been talking about this idea of a causal decision-making, where that money has to be known how it's going to do something that's going to touch the bottom line, right?
Yeah.
Versus with startups have kind of the luxury of what's called more of an effectual model, where we have kind of the big vision of what this could be, right? But it's going to take many smaller experiments to find our pathway to understand where the true value is and how to gain steam, right? And so the different decision-making models is what I'm trying to teach the students to. There is a process in the context of uncertainty. You know, a lot of corporations want to remove uncertainty altogether and minimize risk, right?
Yep.
And obviously startups don't have that luxury. So there are different processes and models in place so that, you know, if this disruptive idea comes into the corporation, usually you go, you know, it could go to the finance or marketing people and like, all right, tell me what's the market size and how much market share we can get from that. And in some instances, right, it's uncalculable, right? Or just kind of fun with Excel at that point, but not anything real, right?
Yeah.
So having something where you have a process where you can go and do different things to explore what these ideas are, rather than them just normally getting killed because they don't fit. Basically, you put into the dominant logic of the corporation and it just does not compute, so it spits it back out, right?
Yeah. Oh, definitely. And you kind of touched on it where the corporates want to see how it's going to impact the bottom line. But the truth is it's going to be years before these startups have any impact on the bottom line. And that's kind of my second point is there's a massive disparity in expectations. A $10 million startup to an external venture firm or somebody looking at it will go, wow, it's a pretty successful small little business you have there. In the context of a $1 billion multinational corporation, it's a complete failure. Even if they got to that point in a year, which would be incredible growth, it just doesn't line up. It's kind of a rounding error to the mothership. One interesting model that I've seen, and it's tough to execute on, is actually spinning out corporate startups and giving them autonomy to operate as an independent startup where the goals and expectations are set, KPIs are set. The mothership still controls equity in the company, so they still have ownership in it, but they're given some level of autonomy to actually go out, build, make mistakes, and function more as a startup rather than as a corporate. And then once they achieve some sort of scale where it can be meaningful to the parent company then reabsorbing that startup back into the main company.
Right.
And that's been something we've seen, get executed quite well when it's done correctly, but there's a lot of messiness involved with it because you have to have the right people. And in a lot of times the corporate don't necessarily want to let those people go. So if they're going out to start a startup, they're no longer going to be working directly with your company. So you could be losing some of your best people to these entrepreneurial endeavors.
Yeah, I mean, if you're, it's tricky, right? When you have a company that's probably not good at this to keep it internal, right?
Hmm.
And then get the foresight of, all right, we know that if we do this in-house, we'll probably kill it. So it needs to be autonomous. One, they're probably not in a place where letting go of control is their forte, right? And two, uh, it's probably they probably don't have any existing processes or ways of hiring someone that is and people that could fit into that kind of structure, right?
Right.
Because of, as you put it, the mothership has done things a certain way, so this thing needs to be different, and so everything it's done in the past needs kind of its own process and own thinking around it, right? And
Yep.
that's problematic, and again probably would be a unique situation of having the right leadership in place to again have that foresight of like, our system is old and stodgy and we'll just muck it up if we try to do this, so we need some kind of external arm to give this a go. And unfortunately it's usually the humans that mess it up, right?
Yeah. I'm curious with your students, if I can ask a question back to you. Are
Yeah.
they mostly coming from technology companies and software type companies? Is it product companies, or is it kind of a mix across the board of the type of students you teach?
It's definitely a mix across the board. I think there are certainly some technology, but I think there are some still kind of traditional manufacturing or service providers, or even I know there's a student kind of in the landscape business and manufacturing, like I said, and some food production and other things like that. So
Okay.
I think certainly there's students across the board in the MBA program, right? But I think this class specifically uh, tickled the brain of certain individuals that are perhaps in situations that might feel that their company is not optimizing their entrepreneurial capabilities, and might have been, kind of the long lasting steady ship,
Yep.
right? And may or may not uh, be concerned about how, a disruptor is just wanting to eat their lunch, right? And I think some of the students are realizing that those things are out there, right? So I think there's some element of, one, just understanding what is corporate entrepreneurship, but also, again, getting into the weeds of, as say, a first line or middle manager wanting to get to kind of the higher management kind of role. How might we introduce these things? How might we, again, just make more tangible things occur? Because probably the reality is our company's probably not going to set up a whole corporate venturing fund, right?
Right.
And so at least not yet. Maybe that's stage 5, right? But
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's important. There are steps to it. These things take a long time to get any sort of buy-in.
right.
Understanding what relationships you need to be forming to get those things done is vital to that, and understanding what sort of small steps you can take to kind of prove to them that you're heading in the right direction is 100% key for buy-in, and having a longer term vision for where it can eventually go to is really important.
And so with the companies you all kind of talk to, what, obviously without getting into the specifics, is more like, um, are the companies already doing something entrepreneurially and looking to add to it or wanting to start from scratch? And then I guess the second question is, what position, what level in the company are these conversations usually with? Are they just with the CEO, or is there someone, because that's always an interesting question too, from an organizational standpoint of who owns corporate entrepreneurship, right? Doesn't seem like anyone owns it. So who are you all speaking with?
So that, I'm going to give you probably your favorite answer as a researcher, and it depends. Most of the clients we work with, and to give some background information too, because I think that might be helpful. The company I work for, Shadow Ventures, at its core, we're a venture capital firm. So we look at startups, typically at the seed stage, to invest in. And typically those are external small startups, 2 to 3 founders that have a minimum viable product. They're in the world of executing on paid pilots and acquiring their first customers. We come in, invest in them, and give them that early capital to help scale. The world we invest is primarily in the built environment. So anything dealing with architects, engineers, general contractors, developers, building owners and operators, it's all kind of the landscape we look in. Through that work, we've developed quite a few corporate relationships with big Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 companies that work in this space and have internal innovation systems in place. And where we've found that we kind of have a stickiness with them is acting as their red team service. So these companies come up with ideas, they come up with products, and they're trying to figure out if there's a there there. So is it something that they should put more money behind and actually pursue? What should be their business strategy for doing it? How can they scale it? And so we kind of come in at a consulting level for that sort of work. So most of them at some level, regardless of the type of firm, have some sort of entrepreneurial activity happening within their company. How they then manage that and how they move those companies through is different around every single one of them. Most of them aren't starting from scratch, but some of them do look to us for how can we do things better or a little bit differently to actually drive more success. And then as far as what level person we're talking to, that really depends on the size of the firm. So some of these companies have tens of thousands of employees all around the world. At that level, it's typically the strategy teams, the innovation teams that we're speaking to. It's the presidents of a particular division that are then overseeing how they're going to grow that division, because to them, it's all about P&L, managing growth today and then managing growth tomorrow and being able to show their bosses that they're doing that. With some of the smaller companies, it's the C-suite. So it's the CEO. A lot of times it's the CFO because the financial decisions in all of this are really big. And then we're increasingly seeing, especially on like the engineering firms and the architecture firms, even the general contractors, they're starting to create CTO positions, which is something that's relatively new. But these companies are seeing a need to be more innovative and use more technology. And so that position is getting increasing power within the organization.
Yeah, I have a friend that has kind of the task of leading a fairly large corporation in entrepreneurship, and he reports to the CTO of that.
Yeah.
Now. So
the one where I think it fails the most is when they're reporting to the CMO, and that oftentimes lands as a spot for internal entrepreneurship because they think marketing goes hand in hand with entrepreneurship and they don't really know where else to put it. Those groups are, and nothing against CMOs, I think their job's extremely important, but those groups are typically where I see the biggest failures happen because it doesn't align with any sort of, and I think it kind of goes back to budget and goals. You know, CMOs are focused on growing existing product lines and companies and not so much creating companies from scratch.
And so, like you said, their kind of major driver then is growth then, obviously.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And are are there usually parameters around that growth, or are they just looking for, new shots in the arm, or how are they usually looking for this?
So a lot of times it goes back to supporting the core business and kind of where they want to go. So without giving away any names, like one company that we work with pretty closely is very interested in IoT. So their core business is looking at how can we grow the Internet of Things? How can we create a new entire business out of this? And so most of their entrepreneurial activity is tied back to that core strategy. And then they're using the entrepreneurial activity to create new features that can bolt into that overall strategy. And that works well because that's typically a top-down initiative. So you're getting the top-down with the executive saying, we need to expand into this area. And then the bottom up is the actual employees coming up with ideas and businesses on how to actually do that.
Do you all, when you kind of are playing this role, do you partner with any other kind of organizations or entities to kind of round out capabilities?
It's not so much partnerships as much as the relationships for doing a little bit more digging. We're able to go and have conversations with companies without mentioning who our client is to really be able to uncover new insights that the parent company can't do. Right. So I'll use like Coca-Cola as an example. Coca-Cola could put some yellow sludge in a can, throw a cool name on it, create a commercial for it, and they could sell a few $1 million worth of that product without people ever even tasting it because it has Coca-Cola's name associated with it. So there's tons of brand equity associated with these companies that can be false indicators for good ideas or good businesses, when in reality, it's not, and it's just your brand equity. If you strip that away and treat it like any other startup and put that same yellow sludge in a can and then go have conversations with people about it, they're going to be a lot less positive and their reaction to it's not going to be nearly the same.
Right. That's a good idea for Coca-Cola.
Yellow sludge in a can. I think that's called Mountain Dew, but that's Pepsi.
Have you worked with any companies and then they kind of, besides a budgetary issue, has there been other issues where they kind of, get scared, or you have the conversation of what this all really means and like, oh, we don't want to do that? Has that ever come up?
Oh yeah. And I think there's I wish I had a better synonym for this, but I call it a lack of guts. I think it's always easier at a corporate level to do nothing or say no than to act today. They have a job to protect. If you take a risk and that risk is wrong, what are the implications going to be for your position? What are the implications going to be for your family if you lose that job because you made the wrong decision? Our boss at Shadow always says nobody ever got fired for hiring McKinsey. It's safe. You know exactly what you're going to get. Is there other people out there that could give a different point of view and do it better and cost less? Probably. But at the end of the day, it's a consistent decision process. The number of times that before I joined Shadow Ventures, I was working for a firm that did outsource corporate venturing. So our whole world was working with these companies on figuring out where do you see growth opportunities, what are your challenges, and then going out and finding startups that they could potentially partner with, creating the whole value propositions around how they could partner together and creating that story for them, making the introductions to both sides. And in 2.5 years, none of the corporate clients I work with ever went forward with any of the relationships that we teed them up for. And we found hundreds and hundreds of companies for these different corporate clients that all fit their challenges. So it is a very frustrating world. And I know it's frustrating for those employees as well, because they're tasked with these jobs and that task doesn't go away. So it's just kind of a never-ending circle.
Do you think, have you all witnessed, other environmental factors usually scare people out of entrepreneurship? Have you seen anything with the pandemic and other stuff where people are losing those guts easier?
Yeah, it's a scary time. On the entrepreneur side, we have a lab program incubator at Shadow. There's 80 startups in it now, and for most of them, if they didn't have signed contracts, signed pilots, or signed investments, that pipeline pretty much dried up overnight as soon as the work from home really hit full force. On the corporate side of things, almost all the corporates we work with are in a wait and hold period where they're trying to stabilize their foundation, make sure they have everything buttoned up as far as operations today, and anything forward looking beyond what's right in front of their nose, because they're in the life of putting out fires, has been put on hold. And that's across the board with all of the corporate clients we work with. Now, I will say I'm seeing things start to level out a little bit. People are figuring out the work from home. People are figuring out that, hey, we can continue to do our jobs through Zoom. We'll see what the future exactly holds, but some of those conversations have started to pick back up and things seem to have steadied some.
Have you had any clients or seen, are some structured differently where the pandemic or other kind of economic downturns doesn't impact their entrepreneurial efforts?
I think this one came out of the blue, and I don't know if anybody was totally prepared for it. We don't do a ton of money or a ton of work with the big tech companies. So I imagine the companies like Amazon that have massive cash reserves are doing just fine. And they look at this world going, it's now time to go start being innovative because there's going to be a lot of opportunities to buy.
Right.
And so for them, the whales, they're gonna feast during this time. Shadow's in a little bit of a similar situation where we're closing our fund right now. So we have a lot of dry powder to go out and invest in startups whose valuations aren't nearly what they were 3-4 months ago. So it's opportunistic if you were in the right position going into this, but if this caught you completely off guard, then I don't think so.
Yeah, I would venture a guess that those that haven't had set structure or kind of this autonomous element already set for this, obviously would scare them off to, well, we don't know if, again, it's seen as a nice to have, right?
Yep.
And we got to make sure that our numbers are going to be okay before we go to the nice to haves versus those that, again, as you said, might already be structured or even have cash reserves to, this is going to screw up a lot of things, right? And gives a lot of potential opportunity to buy things cheap or demand and human behavior has changed pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And so there might be new outlets there for solutions based on fulfilling that, right?
Yep. And one of the companies I spoke with, I think they said it best, where we were talking about doing some stuff with them, and this was just a sponsorship opportunity for this company, and it had interested them before the pandemic and everything hit. And their reaction to all of this was, Brian, we just got word from the top. The goal right now today is protect the people we have, protect what cash we do have, and shore up the core business. And those were their priorities. And I think those are in the right place, honestly, at this time. Like, you don't necessarily need to be 5 years forward looking at that point, because if you're faced with either laying people off and cutting a bunch of jobs or be innovative, I think you've got to look at saving those jobs first and then figure out how to be innovative once you shore up the ship.
Certainly. I mean, there's a hierarchy of needs there, right? That,
yeah. Definitely.
Every company is just bounded by, all humans are bounded by, right?
Yeah.
No, go for it.
Great. I love the hierarchy in these things, because I think that is something, pandemic aside and COVID aside, I think innovation and entrepreneurship within corporations is oftentimes, even when times are good, is too low down on that hierarchy of needs. And I think it is one of the first business units or line items to get cut anytime there's any sort of corporate reorganization. If you look at the average life of a CEO at a public company, it's less than 5 years. And every time a new CEO comes in, one of the first things they completely remake and rechange is their entire corporate innovation program, whether it's just completely eliminating it to show that they can now free up more cash, or if it's revamping it and adding their own flavor to it. There's a constant cycle of disruption happening within that world. And without that consistency of leadership, it's extremely challenging to get anything done. And I think that's why if you look at, and I haven't done a study on this, but I would be interested into seeing the numbers behind like what companies are actually most innovative and how that correlates with the consistency of leadership. But I've had the most success working with private companies that are oftentimes still controlled by the family or a founder, because they have that consistency of leadership and that clear direction, and you understand that your job's going to be safe and this is something coming from the top down. That person's going to be there for the next 10 to 15 years. Or it's a public company that has had the luxury of having the same CEO for a long amount of time.
Yeah, I would say you're probably onto something there of just the tenure of if the founder's still involved, and remembering too just how they started and found original value, right? And if they can ingrain that as part of the dominant logic of a company, versus most companies just start thinking about things once they find success, right? And how can we keep that one thing that was successful going? Versus the process of how we got to finding what's valuable, right? And if we keep that process kind of as our most important process, then we're going to dominate probably. But that's a little trickier to put a whole system to, right? And to control. And I would say that's also, that factor probably prohibits some people wanting to go into this realm, right? Because knowing some of those things don't usually end up well. Why would I go put myself in that situation? Versus,
it's exciting. It's fun. You get to work on new, cool things. There's something about the shiny lure that attracts a lot of people to it. What's driven me to this area is I like looking and working with startups that are looking at what's next, what's new, what's going to change a world, what's going to change a business. And it is a lot riskier career to pursue than, it's something where you're looking at Excel spreadsheets all day.
Oh, we love Excel though. Talk to me about kind of, do companies usually think that this is going to happen quickly and like this is a panacea type fix for everything? And, it's, you just do this entrepreneurship thing and then we're going to, have all this new money coming in and going to fix our business?
Oh yeah. Yeah. I think that's misguided timelines. I think there's a lot of time put into R&D, and we kind of talked about this early on, but a lot of time with the research and the development and making sure that, your Oreo and the next cookie you're going to come out with is just been analyzed and studied in case studies day after day after day. And then when it comes time to actually, and the cookie's probably a bad thing because that's their core business. But if they were releasing something new that they're not in today, they'll overthink the heck out of it. They'll design it until it's been reiterated 1,000 different times down to like exactly what the packaging and the logo looks like on it. And then when it comes time to actually launch it, they think you're just going to have this massive growth and it's just going to explode and everybody's going to love it. And if it doesn't catch on right away, well, then they scrap it and they start all over. And it's like, if you would have stuck with it, continued to iterate and be agile with it, you probably would have had something there and probably could have solved that problem.
Yeah, it's, I just recently watched the Ford versus Ferrari movie.
Mm-hmm.
And it was kind of an interesting take in terms of, uh, Shelby was the guy they hired Ford to win the race, to build him a race car, and basically said, why isn't as awesome as other things you built before? And in the movie, I don't know if this happened in real life, but he told Henry Ford II, like, cause you can't innovate through committee. Like,
Yep.
either we are going to make something awesome and test that out, or it has to pass through 19 different hands before we can make a move on it. Right.
Yeah. It's also a disconnect too between these large companies and who their end customers actually are. There are so many middlemen where that product changes hands before it actually ends up in our hands as the consumers.
Yep.
A lot of times they don't even understand what problem they're trying to solve because they don't know who their customers are or where their products are being used. We see that a lot in the built environment with these building product manufacturers that we work with. They don't know what buildings their systems are actually in because it's been sold to a reseller who's then sold it to somebody else, and then somebody else installed it. So for them to get down that value chain and actually understand what's needed on the level and what's needed at the consumer level is a winding path for them to get to. And I think that Ford versus Ferrari thing kind of leads into that, where you have a lot of people sitting in a room together having a conversation and kind of saying the same things over and over again, and you get a little bit of groupthink happening. But then when you actually get out there in the real world and start talking with who your end customers are, you can get somewhere a lot faster than you could in that room.
Yeah, and I know I've worked with a few kind of engineering companies too, and led by engineers, and they're more interested in building cool stuff, right? And scientifically more advanced and assuming that the customers will also be as excited as they are about the advancement, right?
Yep.
And so I'm sure you've seen this too, where they overthink things and do things that aren't really of value to customers, right?
Yep.
And so that's kind of to the core concept around like the theory of disruption, is companies just keep adding these widgets and things that they think are cool, and so that they can go higher in the market of being the high price element, yet the value of that price to all those widgets, not so great. So this stupid, simple company comes along with just what are the core things for a fraction of the price. And as we talk about kind of attracting non-customers that the big company has kind of forgotten or doesn't want to service, right?
Yep. Yeah. I remember listening to a speech by the head of innovation at P&G a while back, and he told a story about the space pen and NASA's development of it. And NASA put out this, I think kind of what we're talking about is how you frame the question, how you frame the challenge or the problem you're trying to solve, and looking at it from different point of views and through a different context. And so NASA was trying to figure out how can we have a space that can write, or a pen that can write in space, and spent millions of dollars trying to develop this perfect pen that could write in space. And the innovator in the room just held up a pencil and said, here you go. Because the problem wasn't how can you get a pen that can write in space? The problem was how can you write in space?
Right.
So you could have saved millions of dollars in R&D and budget if you would have just gone and bought a 25-cent pencil from the store.
Right.
Because the pencil is going to write in space regardless.
Right. Yeah. How you define things is key, right? And how you define what your business does is key. And two, just drilling down simple, what is the job to be done?
Yeah.
Right. And well, so go for it.
No, that's great, because we run into this all the time, and this is with the external startups that we work with, and explaining that there is a difference between a feature in a company is a really important notion that not a lot of people understand. And by that, I mean, you could have a feature that could be a nice little successful company, but is it going to be a company that can scale to be $1 billion business? And there's a big difference between those. And so many of the corporates that we work with, they're very interested and their innovation is focused on features and not creating new $1 billion businesses.
Right.
And that's a big disconnect within those worlds. Is features are still valuable and they're still important. But there is a difference between that and going out and creating an entire new enterprise company.
Yeah, I'm sure you see that with startups as well. They come in with an idea which is just a feature instead of a company, right?
Yep, most of them.
Because if you come with, wouldn't it be cool if the product did this? Well, what if the main person just builds that feature, right? Then what company do you have, right?
Yes, exactly. Well, and the end customers too, they get overwhelmed with everybody trying to sell them features, and then they have to manage a ton of different relationships. So you expect and I'm just going to use general contractors because we work with them a lot. Do you expect them to have 100 different contracts with 100 different companies that are selling them features, or one company that can manage and have a lot of features that maybe aren't as good, but it's a lot easier for them to manage all those relationships? You don't have to learn. It's kind of like your iPhone and all the apps you have on your iPhone.
Right.
There's a certain amount of app fatigue that takes place because all of the apps are just little feature solutions, and you have to learn how to interact with each one. You have to create a profile for each one of them. You have to remember to log into each one of them, and it just becomes a little bit of a burden.
Yeah. And a lot of people just assume away human behavior, right?
Yeah.
Because this is better than this. Well, that's kind of the idea of the tipping point too. Is it significantly enough for people to switch, right?
Yeah.
And what is that tipping point and how much? Because if you are just a hair better, right, then you might not be revolutionizing the core problem enough to basically need a switch to occur, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, from your customers, there's only so many hours in a day that you can spend on your phone. There's so many dollars in your bank that you can spend on things. So you have to take something away from that customer. They have to give something up to use what you're offering them. So somebody else is going to lose.
Finite resources, one of everybody's problems, right?
Yep.
So what are some good and bad probably strategies that you've seen companies use to play with these things, and again, may have worked or absolutely just kind of crash and burn?
So I don't think there's any one size fits all for any corporation. I think they all need to experiment. They all need to figure out. It largely depends on what industry you're in and what space you're trying to play, what your goals are. And to me, that starts with the top. So it has to start with the executive level, and then they have to lay out a clear vision for this is how they're going to do it. I think the teams that are most successful are the ones that are aligned with a leader that sits on top of their entire organization and is leading all innovation and entrepreneurial efforts under kind of one umbrella. I see a lot of times that the left side of the brain doesn't talk to the right side of the brain. And in these massive corporations where you have tens of thousands of employees, it's the number of times that you have multiple teams working on the exact same problem, looking at a solution and paying external contractors to do the exact same body of work and then not sharing that information is absolutely astounding to me. So when you have a point leader who's in charge of those different things and then can say, this sort of problem is best for our R&D team to be able to solve. This is best for our incubator. This is best for our CVC team. And this is going to be focused on M&A. And then delegating those responsibilities out to those different groups, I think you end up with a lot more of a holistic strategy that's going to impact the bottom a lot more. I think part of what's missing from that entire space is some sort of tool to actually manage that and get real insights into what's most effective and what's actually impacting the business. Because right now, a lot of it's just kind of guesswork and based off of, assumptions and gut feelings, which is why you end up with multiple teams working on multiple things. And then egos get involved too, right? Like
Right.
if you're on the R&D team, well, of course I can build that. Why couldn't I build that? You need me.
Right.
Don't go buy that company. I'll build it for you. And so understanding what the costs are and the ROI associated with the time to build it versus buy it is all extremely important. And I don't know if there's the level of insights there that are needed.
And that brings up a key point too, because again, all of that adds to the fluffiness of it. And so how have you seen companies kind of measure if they're doing good or bad in the space?
I'm trying to think of like a good example of one that has really set up solid metrics behind it. I think the most important way to do it is to set up realistic KPIs when you're first kicking off that project. You have to have some sort of goals that you're trying to hit and some sort of goals that are realistic with the problem you're trying to solve. And then being able to go back and show somebody in a simple way that, yes, I hit these different 5 things. And then because of that, here's the next step that comes based on what we had talked about before. So if it's in the R&D phase or if it's in the incubator phase, because this is where I spend most of my time is with internal corporate startups. If it's in the incubator phase, if that step 1 is, let's get a proof of concept. So take it through like you would a normal startup and follow through similar trajectories. Proof of concept. Okay, what does that mean? That means that we have a minimum viable product and we've had 5 customers sign up for pilot programs with this within this amount of time. Okay, you've done that. Now you graduate to this. And because you graduated to this, you're going to need more money because now you're trying to scale this product a little bit more. So what are your next steps and goals that should be set around that? And how much money do you need to get there? And thinking about it like the way we do with external startups that we invest in and saying, this company's at their seed stage now. This is exactly what they're going to use that money for, how far that money is going to go. And when that money runs out, they're going to have done this, this, and this, and that's going to set them up to raise their Series A. And this is how much they're going to need to raise at that point, and here's exactly what's going to happen. And thinking about it in a more of a systematic and structured way is, I think, vital to all of that.
Yeah, I think, again, kind of we've been talking about this idea of effectual decision-making, and kind of the core concept is, and the financial side of it is kind of thinking of affordable loss. And all right, here's $1 million that we can lose if that's what happens, right? But it's mainly there to do little experiments and to key customers, key strategic alliances that get buy-in early, right? And also allow us not to have to develop all new capabilities. So we might find partners that kind of get us quicker to a minimum viable product, right?
Yep.
And again, kind of investing in more so the process, like you're saying, than just the outcomes, right? Because the outcomes, maybe a 1% hit rate is an incredible outcome, right?
Yeah.
And that's different than what a lot of companies, we put money in and more money should come out always, right? Because we always talk too about how ludicrous is the idea that a company's only successful if it grows every year. And the only thing that grows infinite like that is cancer. Everything else, a healthy kind of life cycle is not continuous growth, right?
Right.
And so it kind of creates a false mechanism of, again, what it takes to have other arms of the monster grow so
Yeah.
that perhaps that growth will come. But forcing
Well,
it is hard.
it's also a lot easier to go from $1 to $2 than $1 billion to $2 billion. So
True.
understanding where that company is and what growth can be achieved at that point is really important. With a lot of the startups we work with, we'll set some pretty aggressive growth terms for them, but that's because today they're at 0 customers. So should you be able to get to 10 customers by the end of the year, if you look at that as a percentage, that's incredible growth.
Right.
But if you already have those 10 customers, do we expect you to get to 20 the next year? Well, maybe. But at some point, you have to start setting different expectations and leveling things off and setting different performances around different areas. So maybe then it becomes, okay, now you need to start improving your margins. So you can continue to adjust those KPIs depending on where that entrepreneurial company is in their life cycle and what they should actually be focused on at that point based on their stage. It kind of goes back to, I think, the timing thing. You know, a lot of the companies we work with, they've spent 2 years developing their product. So to think that like entrepreneurs are just like these little magic bubbles that all of a sudden a month later, like Facebook's built, that's a really, I think, big misconception within the corporate world is how much time goes into corporate startups. You know, one company most people probably haven't heard of unless you work in the industry that we track pretty closely is a company called Procore. And they're a building job site management platform for general contractors and subcontractors. Multi-billion-dollar company at this point. They're getting ready for their IPO, and then people are like, it's an overnight success story. And the startup that came out of nowhere, Procore is a 16-year-old company. It took them a long time to get to that point. Even if you go look at, in my last company, we worked pretty closely with Beyond Meat. And the number of articles that were like the emergence of alternative protein. Beyond Meat's over a 10-year-old company. Like, these entrepreneurs have been at this and been at the grind for a really long time, and they've gone through their bumps and bruises and they've gone through those life cycles. And a lot of times what the corporates see are these headlines around, you know, Beyond Meat's going to completely revolutionize the plantless diet. And that's where they get fixated on. And they don't go back and actually look at how long it took that company to get there and the different stages that they went through and the different products that they came out with to get to where they are today.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something for a corporation, but I think that's for a lot of humans, right? Not paying attention. You know, many undergrads believe, like, you know, you're automatic. Well, I mean, to some extent, the culture does that as we celebrate these godlike creatures of these outliers of entrepreneurship, right?
Yeah.
One day we didn't know them, and now we know them, and they're billionaires. But yeah, the reality of these things, I don't know what the average entrepreneur is over 40 and has been either in a job or working in the space for over 15 years. And, you know, it's not just this eureka moment and everything floods your way and all this cash keeps flowing by and everything's gravy.
Best startups we see are in industry professionals, worked in a space for at least a decade and have a really strong understanding of the challenges in that space, didn't see a solution for it and decided to go build it themselves.
Right.
It's not even a fair comparison between the quality of companies that those founders are building compared to the 20-something-year-old that just graduated with a degree that comes to us with a business idea. Experience speaks volume. And there are those that come through that are those kind of brilliant young people that come up with incredible ideas and become those billionaires. But I think it's like you were just saying, it's few and far between compared to the experienced professionals that really have a deep understanding of the space.
Well, anytime you can name those individuals, that means there's not that many of them, right? So the odds, things are still occurring, but those numbers still stay the same. So,
Yep.
um, well, we're almost to an hour here, and so we want to make sure to keep the students' attention long enough. So is there any kind of last parting words of, again, with the concept of future decision makers, of maybe in companies or spaces that are just starting to emerge or wanting to be more entrepreneurial?
Yeah. I think patience is kind of a big theme that we continued to touch today. Understand that the corporation that you're working for is going to move slow, but it doesn't mean that you should necessarily give up on your entrepreneurial endeavors with it. Making sure that you're talking to the right people, building the right people, and slowly introducing these new concepts is key to really getting adoption within that company. And there are a lot of companies that do entrepreneurship well. And so if you're looking for that sort of culture, don't be afraid to go look for it and figure out exactly who's out there and ask the right questions around how different companies treat different things within their organizations, and ask them what sort of results they've seen from it. Is it just something that's fluffy, or is it something that has actually resulted in something real tangible, has some great success stories and some really cool case studies that have come out of it?
Yeah, I think that'd be an interesting exercise is for everyone, whatever space they're operating in, find the one company that might be doing this best.
Yeah.
And understanding why and what they're doing, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And that might serve two purposes. One, it kind of can demonstrate how this can be done in a space that seems improbable, right? But then it might also be a bit of an influencer to the higher ups of, I know whenever I ask bosses for things, I always want to target peers that they think they're better than, right? So our company is a higher tier than this company, but they're somewhat peers. That might drive some of that element where, well, if they're doing it, we can't just let them win at this, right?
Right.
So could serve this purpose. Yeah, I think there's a lot there. Thank you so much for taking an afternoon to geek out with me about this. I'm sure we can go 5 more hours, but
Easily.
there's a lot there, and a lot good and bad, right? And like I said, what we're doing here is trying to kind of and get past all the buzzwords and the fluffiness, and just put away the magical wand of, corporate entrepreneurship and go to what is it, who are the leaders, what are the structures, what are the resources, what's the strategy, what are the human resources, what is the hiring that you might need to do, what types of people do these things, right? Reevaluating all that stuff to things that companies already do, and maybe introduce some new processes like effectuation. They've learned a little bit. This week we're going to learn about design thinking.
Awesome.
They've looked at some things about the lean launch pad and that whole process, right?
Yeah.
And so just elements like that might slowly get incorporated into companies, so that, again, once they are in charge of the purse, as it were, they might be able to make some more substantial changes.
That's perfect. All right. Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. And best of luck to you and all your students. Stay safe and stay healthy.
You too. Thank you, sir.
Perfect. All right. I'll talk to you later.
All right. Bye.